The lights of Washington, D.C. glowed against the night sky as the Capitol buzzed with anticipation. Inside a packed auditorium, cameras from every major news outlet pointed toward the stage where an unexpected political showdown was about to begin. On one side stood Texas Governor Greg Abbott, his presence calm but unwavering, representing the grit and independence of the Lone Star State. On the other was House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, polished, fiery, and ready to prove that his vision of America was the one destined to shape the future. The moderator introduced the evening's topic, the balance of state power versus federal authority. It was a subject tailor-made for Sparks, and everyone in the room knew it. Social media hashtags were already trending, hashtag Abbott versus Jeffries and hashtag Texas versus DC. Abbott leaned forward in his wheelchair, his voice steady but commanding. Texans don't wait on Washington to solve their problems. We build, we fight, we endure. His words drew thunderous applause from supporters scattered across the crowd. But Jeffries smirked, his tone laced with mockery as he shot back. Governor Abbott talks like Texas is its own country. Maybe if he spent less time playing cowboy and more time addressing real problems, his state wouldn't rank where it does in healthcare and education. The audience gasped, half cheers and half boos echoing across the chamber. Abbott didn't flinch. His eyes locked on Jeffries, a storm gathering beneath his calm exterior. This wasn't going to be a polite debate, it was going to be a clash of philosophies, egos, and visions for America's future. The tension was electric, the kind that made viewers at home lean closer to their screens. Everyone sensed that what was about to unfold wasn't just another political argument, it was a battle that could define how Americans viewed leadership, resilience, and the fight between federal control and state independence. The first punch had been thrown, and Abbott was ready to answer. The audience was still buzzing from Jeffries' jab when Abbott raised his hand, signaling for silence. His calm, collected demeanor was in stark contrast to the roar of reactions in the chamber. Congressman Jeffries, Abbott began, his voice steady but layered with steel, you mock Texas like it's a punchline. But let me tell you something, Texans don't bow to Washington, and we sure don't apologize for standing tall. The crowd erupted again, this time with louder cheers. Cameras zoomed in on Abbott's expression, unwavering, sharp, and determined. Jeffries leaned back in his chair, smirking, and tossed another insult. Governor Abbott loves to talk tough about independence. But the truth is, Texas takes more federal aid than almost any other state. Maybe without Washington, your so-called independence would collapse. The words cut deep, sparking gasps across the room. Even some neutral observers leaned forward, waiting to see if Abbott would stumble. But instead, Abbott smiled faintly, the kind of smile that signaled confidence, not defeat. Let me correct that myth right here, Abbott fired back. His tone sharpened, every word carrying the weight of courtroom precision. Texans pay more in taxes to Washington than we ever see back. And while politicians like you sit in D.C. passing out dollars for votes, we're down in Texas building jobs, protecting families, and securing a border that your administration has failed to defend. The auditorium shook with applause, this time louder than before. Abbott's words landed like a hammer, cutting through the noise of Jeffries' mockery. Jeffries, caught off guard, quickly tried to regain control. He leaned forward, voice rising. What you call independence, I call neglect. Neglect of healthcare, neglect of education, neglect of the people who deserve more than slogans about toughness. Abbott didn't flinch. His eyes narrowed, and with deliberate calm, he said, and what you call leadership, Congressman, I call politics as usual. Washington speeches don't fix broken communities. Texans don't want pity, they want respect. And that starts with recognizing their right to govern themselves. The crowd erupted again, half the room on its feet, half shaking their heads. The clash had officially escalated, and everyone watching could feel it, this was no ordinary debate. It was a showdown between two competing visions of America. The atmosphere in the auditorium grew heavier with every exchange. What had started as a debate was quickly turning into a battle of ideologies. The audience could feel the tension radiating between the two men, Abbott with his calm, steel-like presence, and Jeffries with his sharp, fiery energy. Jeffries leaned forward, jabbing the air with his finger. Governor Abbott talks about respect, but what kind of respect do Texans get when hospitals close in rural areas, when teachers strike, when families can't afford their prescriptions? You stand here boasting about independence, but independence doesn't pay the bills. His words drew nods from some in the crowd, especially younger voters and progressives seated near the front. Abbott waited for the murmurs to fade before responding. His voice dropped lower, but it carried like thunder across the room. Respect is earned by action, not empty promises. While Washington drowns in bureaucracy, Texans have created the #1 state for job growth in America. We've attracted businesses, built industries, and empowered people to succeed without waiting for your permission slips. The applause was immediate, rolling like a wave through the chamber. Cameras flashed as Abbott leaned into the microphone, his tone now razor-sharp. Congressman Jeffries, you mock our resilience. But let me ask you, what has Washington done for the people in your district? More red tape? More taxes? More division? Jeffries' smile faltered for just a moment, but he quickly fired back. Governor, what you call freedom, I call chaos. A patchwork of laws that leave millions behind. States can't pick and choose which Americans deserve opportunity. That's why we need national leadership, not cowboy politics. Abbott didn't miss a beat. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Jeffries. And what you call national leadership, I call Washington arrogance. You think one-size-fits-all solutions work for every family in this country? Not in Texas. Not anywhere. The audience was split down the middle, half clapping, half jeering. Reporters' fingers flew across keyboards, capturing every second for headlines that would dominate the next morning. The stakes had risen. Both men were no longer just defending policies, they were defending identities, values, and the very soul of America's future. The debate had reached a fever pitch. The crowd, divided like a battlefield, was hanging on every word. The moderator tried to step in, but Abbott and Jeffries were locked in, neither willing to yield. Jeffries struck again, his voice sharp with sarcasm. Governor Abbott loves to paint Texas as a land of opportunity, but tell that to the families struggling without healthcare, or to the students in overcrowded classrooms. Independence sounds nice until it leaves people behind. The jab landed with precision, drawing applause from his supporters. But Abbott didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned into the microphone, his Texas drawl steady, his tone sharper now than before. Congressman Jeffries, he began, eyes narrowing, you talk about Texans being left behind, but let me remind you, it's Washington's policies that drive up healthcare costs. It's Washington's red tape that suffocates small businesses. It's Washington's empty promises that fail our teachers and students. The crowd erupted, louder than ever. Abbott raised his hand, steadying the room. And while you sit in Washington mocking us, Texas is leading. We're the energy capital of America. We're #1 in job creation. Families are moving to Texas by the thousands because they know we don't wait for bureaucrats to save us, we take action. Jeffries smirked, leaning forward like a boxer going for the knockout. Governor, you keep bragging about Texas. But let's be real, without federal funding, your so-called independence collapses. You can't run a country inside a country. That's when Abbott's eyes lit with fire. His response came like a lightning strike. And without states like Texas, Congressman, Washington collapses. We pay the bills. We fuel the economy. We defend the border when you won't. You laugh at Texas, but it's Texas holding this country together. The audience gasped, then roared in approval. Even some who had cheered for Jeffries sat stunned by the force of Abbott's words. It was a turning point, a moment where the tide seemed to shift, the narrative bending in Abbott's favor. Reporters whispered to each other, already drafting headlines. Abbott strikes back, Texas governor shifts debate momentum, Jeffries' mockery backfires. The air was electric. Abbott had turned the insult into fuel, and the fight was far from over. The roar of the audience carried like a wave, rolling through the hall and shaking the walls. Cameras captured the split reactions, half the crowd rising to their feet for Abbott, the other half booing, their voices drowned out by the thunder of applause. Jeffries tried to speak, but the noise swallowed his words. The moderator's gavel struck the podium in vain, the chamber transformed into a battlefield of chants. Abbott! Abbott! Thundered from one side, while Jeffries! Jeffries! Answered from the other. Abbott sat back for a moment, calm in the chaos, letting the energy soak in. His hands clasped on the podium, his eyes steady on his opponent. When the chants finally dulled, he leaned into the microphone again, his tone measured but commanding. "You hear that, Congressman?" Abbott asked, gesturing toward the divided room. "That's America. Loud, divided, passionate, but alive. And you know what they're tired of? They're tired of being mocked. They're tired of politicians turning their struggles into punchlines." The crowd hushed, listening. Abbott's words sliced through the air. "You laughed at Texas tonight. But you weren't laughing when our energy kept the lights on in half this country. You weren't laughing when Texas businesses carried jobs through your shutdowns. And you sure weren't laughing when Texans defended this nation's values while Washington faltered." Gasps echoed, followed by applause that rose again like rolling thunder. Abbott's voice grew stronger, his Texas drawl ringing with conviction. "You think mocking us makes you strong, Congressman Jeffries. But let me tell you, strength is built in the fields, in the oil rigs, in the classrooms, in the homes of Texans who fight every day. That's what you'll never understand from behind a polished desk in D.C." Jeffries' face tightened. For the first time, the smirk was gone. He shifted in his seat, clearly rattled. The camera zoomed in, catching every flicker of discomfort. Abbott had landed a blow that pierced deeper than statistics or policy debates. It was personal, it was cultural, it was raw. The audience sensed it. The narrative was shifting. The laughter had turned to silence, the mockery to unease. And Abbott wasn't done. The silence in the hall was deafening after Abbott's last words. For the first time that night, Hakeem Jeffries looked unsettled. The audience could feel the shift. Abbott had seized control of the narrative, and now he was pressing the advantage. Abbott leaned forward, his voice calm but cutting like a blade. "Congressman, you think mocking Texas makes you clever. But let's talk about results. Under your leadership in Washington, crime rates in major cities have soared. Homelessness is at record highs. Families can't afford groceries. Meanwhile, in Texas, we're building, growing, and leading. So tell me, who should really be laughed at?" The audience erupted again, with chants of "Abbott! Abbott!" filling the chamber. Jeffries shifted, gripping his microphone tighter, his composure slipping. Abbott pressed on, his eyes never leaving Jeffries. "You mock me, but the truth is this: Texans don't need your approval. We don't need Washington elites telling us how to live, how to work, or how to raise our families. We've done just fine on our own, and frankly, Congressman, we're doing better than you are." The camera cut to Jeffries, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowing as he searched for a comeback. But the damage had been done. The laughter that once filled his side of the audience had vanished. Abbott's words had hit like a hammer, leaving Jeffries with nothing but silence behind him. One reporter whispered into his microphone for the live broadcast, "This may be the moment Jeffries loses the room." Abbott leaned back slightly, his smile faint but confident, as the crowd continued to cheer. He had turned mockery into momentum, and he wasn't stopping there. The tension in the studio was unbearable. Greg Abbott had just flipped the script, and everyone knew it. The audience buzzed, the energy leaning heavily in Abbott's favor. Reporters typed furiously, commentators whispering to producers in their headsets. Jeffries straightened his shoulders, refusing to let the moment slip away. He leaned forward, forcing a smile, his voice sharper now. Governor Abbott loves to throw stones, but let's not forget, Texas has its own problems. Power grids failing, schools underfunded, families struggling with healthcare costs. You talk big about independence, but when disaster strikes, you're the first to ask Washington for help. The jab drew scattered applause from his supporters, but the force wasn't there anymore. The momentum had shifted, and Abbott knew it. He didn't wait long. He leaned into his mic, his expression firm, his voice steady as iron. Congressman, Texans don't back down from hardship. We face it head-on. When storms hit, when the grid faltered, we didn't cry for pity, we rebuilt, stronger than before. That's the Texas way. We don't wait for Washington to save us. We save ourselves. The audience erupted again, some rising to their feet. The cheers overpowered the few claps for Jeffries. Abbott raised his hand, commanding the noise to settle. And let's be crystal clear, Abbott continued. Yes, Texas has challenges. Every state does. But while Washington points fingers, we take responsibility. While D.C. politicians argue on TV, Texans are working, building, thriving. That's the difference between talk and leadership. The crowd thundered in approval, reporters murmuring that Abbott had regained full control. Jeffries' face tightened, his attempt to recover slipping through his fingers like sand. It was clear, the congressman's laughter had ignited a fight, but Abbott's comeback was setting the narrative ablaze. The atmosphere in the hall felt electric, like a storm brewing over open plains. Abbott had dismantled Jeffries' mocking tone, but now the energy was shifting into something bigger, a test of who truly spoke for the people watching at home. Jeffries leaned back, shaking his head with a smirk, trying to regain some swagger. Governor, you talk about Texas pride as if it's the only pride that matters. But let's not forget, this is the United States of America. And when Texans stumble, it's the rest of the country that picks them up. You can't just wave a flag and act like the Lone Star State doesn't need anyone else. His words earned polite applause, but nothing close to the roar Abbott commanded earlier. Abbott waited, patient as ever, then leaned forward, his Texas drawl cutting through the tension. Congressman, no one here doubts we're the United States. But unity doesn't mean Washington gets to run every corner of our lives. Unity doesn't mean mocking the people you claim to serve. True unity comes from respect, from listening, not laughing. The audience erupted, the sound thunderous and sustained. Even some who'd clapped for Jeffries earlier now nodded slowly, visibly moved by Abbott's appeal to respect and dignity. Abbott's gaze swept the room. You laughed at Texans as if our struggles were a joke. But let me ask you, were the families who fought through hurricanes laughing? Were the ranchers battling droughts laughing? Were the small business owners who kept going during shutdowns laughing? No, Congressman. They weren't. And the fact that you were? That says more about you than it ever will about Texas. The chamber roared. Some stood on their feet, chanting Abbott's name. The camera cut to Jeffries, his smirk gone, his lips pressed into a tight line. The weight of Abbott's words had settled heavy, leaving the congressman visibly shaken. It was no longer just a debate, it was a reckoning. The audience was on fire now, their energy pouring into Abbott like fuel to a flame. Cameras zoomed in on him as he leaned closer to the mic, his tone dropping into something quieter, sharper, every word landing with precision. Congressman Jeffries, Abbott began, his eyes locked on his opponent, you mock me, you mock Texas, but let me tell you what you can't mock. You can't mock the mother in Houston working 2 jobs just to keep her kids fed. You can't mock the farmer in Lubbock who hasn't seen rain in weeks but still gets up at dawn to work his land. You can't mock the soldier who puts his life on the line, only to come home and see politicians treating his sacrifice like a punchline. The crowd hushed, listening intently, every word gripping them. Abbott's voice grew steadier, more powerful. This isn't about politics anymore, it's about respect. Respect for people who don't live in Washington, who don't sit in cushy offices making rules they'll never have to follow. You laugh at Texans, Congressman. But what you don't realize is this: when you laugh at us, you awaken us. And Texans, when awakened, don't just fight back. They win. The roar that followed was thunderous, shaking the walls of the chamber. Supporters stood, waving flags, some stomping their feet as chants of "Texas! Texas! Texas!" filled the air. Jeffries sat still, his smirk erased, his face flushed under the stage lights. The laughter he had started now felt like a distant memory, a mistake that had given Abbott the opening of a lifetime. One commentator whispered off camera, "That wasn't just a response. That was a declaration." Abbott just turned the debate into history. Abbott sat back, calm and collected, letting the chants roll on. His point was made. His comeback had become his crown. The chants of "Texas! Texas!" rolled like thunder, shaking the stage as Greg Abbott leaned forward once more. He waited, letting the voices swell, then raised his hand. The room hushed almost instantly, the silence as powerful as the roar had been. Abbott's eyes locked on Jeffries, but his words were aimed at every camera, every living room across America. His voice was calm, steady, but carried the weight of steel. Congressman Jeffries thought he could laugh his way through this debate. He thought mocking Texans would make him stronger. But tonight, he learned something every politician eventually learns: Texans don't break. They don't back down. And when you underestimate them, you don't just lose an argument. You lose the people's respect. The audience erupted once again, this time with a conviction that shook the air. Abbott's voice rose, his Texas drawl echoing like a verdict. Let this be a lesson, not just for Washington elites, but for anyone watching. Respect matters. Dignity matters. And when you mock hardworking families, you don't just face me, you face all of Texas. And that's a fight you cannot win. The chamber shook with thunderous applause, cameras flashing like lightning. Jeffries sat stiff, the weight of his earlier laughter crushing down on him. His attempt to belittle Abbott had spiraled into a moment that would be replayed across every news cycle, every social feed, every headline in America. As the lights dimmed and the debate drew to a close, one thing was clear. Greg Abbott hadn't just defended himself. He had turned ridicule into reverence, mockery into momentum. The night would be remembered not for Jeffries' laughter, but for Abbott's comeback, a comeback that defined him not as a man mocked, but as a leader who could not be broken. Tonight's story showed us something powerful. You can try to mock, you can try to laugh, but when you stand against Greg Abbott and the spirit of Texas, you'll always be met with strength, resolve, and a comeback that leaves the room silent. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more stories that capture these powerful moments in American politics, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss an update. And now we want to hear from you. What did you think about Jeffries' attempt to mock Abbott? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because your voice matters here.